Hollow Creek was the kind of town that looked like it belonged in a postcard, quaint, picturesque, with a population so small that everyone knew everyone else's business. The town was surrounded by dense woods that seemed to stretch on forever, the trees towering and ancient, their thick canopy casting the town in perpetual twilight. Emily Dawson, a young woman fresh out of college, was looking for a change. The hustle and bustle of the city had worn her down, and when she saw the job listing for a librarian in Hollow Creek, it seemed like fate. She imagined peaceful days surrounded by books, quiet evenings in her own little house, and the kind of simple, small-town life she'd always read about in novels. When she arrived, Hollow Creek was everything she'd hoped for: charming streets lined with old-fashioned lampposts, a single diner where the locals gathered, and a sense of community that was as comforting as it was unfamiliar. The library, a Burke building with ivy crawling up its walls, was as quaint as the town itself. It was filled with dusty old books, the kind that smelled of history and forgotten stories. Emily loved it instantly. The townsfolk welcomed her warmly, though there was a certain reticence in their friendliness, a wariness that Emily attributed to her being an outsider. But she shrugged it off. After all, small towns had their quirks, and she was determined to make this place her home. As the days turned into weeks, Emily settled into her new routine. She spent her days cataloging books, chatting with the regulars who came into the library, and exploring the town's little shops and cafes. The locals were friendly enough, but she noticed that they rarely lingered near the woods. When she asked about it, they would change the subject or offer vague, dismissive answers. It wasn't until her third week in town that Emily first heard the story of the Watcher. She was closing up the library one evening when a group of teenagers came in, looking for a book on local legends for a school project. One of the boys, a lanky kid with a mop of red hair, mentioned the Watcher in a hushed tone, as if even saying the name aloud might summon something. Curious, Emily asked them about it, but the kids grew quiet, exchanging uneasy glances. Finally, one of the girls, a shy brunette with glasses, spoke up. "It's just a story," she said, though her voice wavered. "An old legend. Supposedly, there's this thing in the woods. A spirit or something. They say it watches people who wander too far into the forest. And if it sees you, you're never the same again." The others quickly shushed her, and they left the library in a hurry, leaving Emily with more questions than answers. She tried to brush it off, attributing it to overactive teenage imaginations, but the unease lingered. Later that night, as she lay in bed, the wind howling outside her window, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. But it was just the wind, she told herself, just her mind playing tricks on her in a new, unfamiliar place. Or so she thought. It was a chilly October evening when Emily found the book. She had stayed late at the library, determined to finish reorganizing a particularly neglected section in the back corner. The dim light from the old chandeliers barely reached this far, casting long shadows across the row of shelves. As she was placing the last of the books on the shelf, her hand brushed against something hard and cold. Pulling it out, she found herself holding an old, leather-bound book, its cover worn and cracked, with no title or any distinguishing marks. Curiosity piqued, Emily took the book to her desk. The leather felt oddly warm under her fingers, and when she opened it, a faint smell of earth and decay wafted up from the pages. The book was filled with handwritten text in a language she didn't recognize, the script looping and ornate. But what caught her attention were the illustrations. They were dark and unsettling, filled with twisted trees, shadows that seemed to move on their own, and in the center of every drawing, a figure, tall, thin, and faceless. The figure was always watching, always lurking just out of reach, its featureless face somehow more terrifying than any monstrous visage could be. As Emily flipped through the pages, a cold shiver ran down her spine. The further she went, the more disturbing the images became. The trees seemed to grow denser, the shadows darker, and the figure. It seemed to move closer, as if it was getting nearer with every turn of the page. Suddenly, a cold breeze swept through the library, flickering the candles on her desk. Emily froze, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. Slowly, she turned around, half expecting to see something lurking in the shadows behind her. But there was nothing. Just the dim, silent library. Shaking off the unease, she closed the book and decided to take it home. She couldn't explain it, but something about it fascinated her. It was unlike anything she'd ever seen before, and she was determined to figure out what it was. That night, as she sat by the fire in her little cottage, she opened the book again. The illustration seemed even more unsettling in the flickering firelight, the shadows dancing across the pages as if they were alive. As she studied the drawings, she noticed something she hadn't seen before: a small, barely noticeable figure standing among the trees in the background of each scene. The Watcher. A chill ran down her spine as she realized that in every picture, the figure was getting closer, its faceless head turning ever so slightly toward her. It was as if it was following her through the pages, drawing nearer with every turn. Suddenly, the fire in the hearth flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. Emily gasped, her heart racing as she scrambled to relight the candles. In the darkness, she could have sworn she heard something: a faint rustling, like the sound of leaves being disturbed by a breeze. But when the room was finally bathed in the warm glow of candlelight, there was nothing there. Just the silent, empty room and the book, lying open on the table, its pages whispering secrets she wasn't sure she wanted to hear. That night, Emily fell into a restless sleep, the images from the book lingering in her mind. The fire had been relit, but its warmth did little to chase away the cold that had settled deep in her bones. As she drifted off, the shadows in her room seemed to lengthen, creeping closer as if drawn to her. She dreamed of the forest. In her dream, she stood at the end of Hollow Creek Woods, the trees looming over her like dark sentinels. The air was thick with the scent of moss and decay, and a dense fog clung to the ground, swirling around her feet like tendrils. She knew she shouldn't go in, but something compelled her forward. The forest called to her, its silent voice whispering promises she couldn't resist. She stepped into the woods, the branches closing in around her, the path disappearing behind her as if the forest itself was swallowing her whole. The deeper she went, the darker it became, the trees growing thicker, their gnarled branches twisting into unnatural shapes. The fog grew denser, and soon, she couldn't see more than a few feet in front of her. But she kept going, drawn by a force she couldn't explain. And then she saw the Watcher. It stood among the trees, tall and thin, its faceless head turned toward her. It was just as it had been in the book, only now it was real, its presence overwhelming. It didn't move, didn't speak, but she could feel its eyes on her, cold and unblinking, watching her every move. Fear gripped her, but she couldn't turn back. Her feet refused to obey, rooted to the ground as if the earth itself held her in place. The Watcher raised a hand, its long, bony fingers pointing at her, and she felt a cold chill wash over her, seeping into her bones. Then, in a voice that echoed through the trees, the Watcher whispered her name. Emily. The sound of her name, twisted and distorted, echoed in her mind, and she screamed, the sound tearing through the silence of the woods. But no one heard her. No one came to save her. She was alone in the forest, trapped in the Watcher's gaze, unable to escape. She woke up with a start, drenched in sweat, her heart pounding in her chest. The dream had been so vivid, so real, that for a moment, she wasn't sure if she was still asleep. The room was dark, the fire reduced to glowing embers, and the silence was thick and oppressive. Emily sat up, trying to calm her racing heart, but the memory of the dream lingered, the Watcher's voice echoing in her mind. She glanced at the book on the table, its presence suddenly ominous, as if it was the source of everything she had seen. She should have left it at the library. She knew that now. But it was too late. The Watcher had seen her, and somehow, she knew that it would never let her go. The next morning, Emily tried to go about her day as usual, but the dream had left her shaken. She couldn't focus, her mind constantly drifting back to the Watcher. The image of its faceless figure haunted her, appearing in every shadow, every dark corner of the library. The townsfolk noticed her distraction. Mrs. Green, an elderly woman who was one of the library's regulars, commented on how pale Emily looked. The local shopkeeper, Mr. Jacobs, offered her a free coffee, saying she looked like she needed it. Even the kids who came in after school to browse the comic section gave her curious glances. But Emily brushed off their concerns, forcing a smile and pretending everything was fine. She didn't want to seem like the paranoid newcomer, especially over something as ridiculous as a dream. Yet, the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. Every time she turned her back, she felt its eyes on her, cold and unblinking. She began to notice little things, shadows that seemed to stretch too far, the faint sound of rustling leaves when there was no wind, the way the light dimmed slightly whenever she passed by the windows. The worst was the reflection in the library's old glass door. Several times, as she was closing up, she caught a glimpse of something behind her, a tall, dark figure standing just out of sight. But whenever she spun around, there was nothing there. It was driving her mad. At evening, after another unsettling day, Emily decided to get rid of the book. She would return it to the library and lock it away, forget she'd ever found it. Maybe then, the Watcher would leave her alone. As she left her house, the air outside was still and cold, the kind of chill that cut straight to the bone. The streets of Hollow Creek were eerily quiet, the town seemed almost deserted. The only sound was the crunch of her boots on the gravel road and the occasional rustle of leaves from the forest beyond. When she reached the library, the sun had set, and the building loomed before her, dark and silent. She fumbled with the key, her hands shaking, as a sense of dread settled over her. The door creaked as it opened, and she hesitated before stepping inside, the darkness beyond the threshold more intimidating than ever. As she walked down the dim aisles toward the back of the library, she felt it again, that presence. It was stronger here, more oppressive, as if the Watcher was waiting for her, lurking just out of sight. Emily reached the shelf where she had found the book and hesitated. Her heart pounded in her chest as she looked at the empty spot on the shelf, her mind racing with thoughts of the dream, the whispers, the shadows. She should leave it here. Walk away and never look back. But something compelled her to open it one last time. As if in a trance, she opened the book to the last page she had read, the illustration of the Watcher staring back at her. It was different now, closer, more detailed. She could almost make out features on its face, twisted and distorted, as if it were trying to take shape. Suddenly, the room grew colder, the candles on her desk flickering as if caught in a sudden breeze. A sense of overwhelming dread washed over her, and she knew, with a sickening certainty, that she was no longer alone. The Watcher was here. Emily slowly lifted her eyes from the book, her breath catching in her throat. At the far end of the library, where the shadows were deepest, she saw it, a tall, dark figure standing between the shelves, its faceless head turned toward her. It didn't move, but she could feel its gaze, cold and unrelenting, piercing through the darkness. Panic gripped her, and she backed away, the book slipping from her hands and falling to the floor with a dull thud. But she couldn't look away. Her feet refused to move, her body frozen as the Watcher slowly began to move toward her, its footsteps silent on the old wooden floor. Closer and closer it came, until it was mere feet from her, towering over her like a shadow that had come to life. She could see the darkness beneath its hood, a void that seemed to suck in all light, all hope. In the silence, the Watcher reached out a hand, its long fingers almost brushing her face. The air around her grew colder, the shadows deepening as if the world itself was fading away. And then, in that same cold, echoing voice from her dream, it spoke, "You are mine." Emily bolted from the library, slamming the door behind her as if that thin barrier could protect her from the thing inside. Her heart raced as she sprinted down the empty streets, the shadows of the town stretching toward her, reaching out like dark tendrils. She didn't stop until she reached her house, her lungs burning and her hands trembling. She fumbled with the key, glancing over her shoulder, half expecting to see the Watcher standing in the middle of the road, watching her with its hollow eyes. But there was nothing there. Just the silent, empty streets of Hollow Creek. She locked the door behind her and collapsed onto the couch, her mind racing. She couldn't stay here. She had to leave, had to get away from the Watcher before it took her like it had taken the others. The others. She realized now why the townsfolk had been so wary, why they had refused to talk about the woods, about the Watcher. They knew. They all knew. And they had let her walk right into its grasp. Panic set in as she grabbed her phone and started looking up bus schedules, train times, anything that would get her out of Hollow Creek. But there was nothing until morning. She was trapped here for the night, with the Watcher out there, waiting for her. Emily spent the night huddled on the couch, every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of leaves outside sending her heart racing. She kept the lights on, but the shadows seemed to press in closer, the darkness gathering at the edges of the room. And then, just before dawn, she heard a soft, almost imperceptible knock at the door. Her breath caught in her throat, and she froze, her heart pounding in her ears. The knock came again, louder this time, more insistent. She stared at the door, willing herself not to move, not to make a sound. But the knocking continued, a slow, deliberate rhythm that echoed through the silent house. Finally, she couldn't take it anymore. She stood up, her legs shaking, and crept toward the door. She had to know. She had to see if it was really there. With trembling hands, she reached for the doorknob and slowly, ever so slowly, turned it. The door creaked as it opened, revealing the dark, empty street outside. There was no one there. Relief flooded through her, and she almost laughed at how ridiculous she had been. Of course, it was just her imagination. There was no Watcher. It was all just a. Her thoughts were cut off as she felt a cold breath on the back of her neck. She spun around, but it was too late. The Watcher was there, standing in the doorway, its faceless head inches from hers. She tried to scream, but no sound came out as the darkness enveloped her, pulling her into the void. The last thing she heard was the Watcher's voice, cold and final. Mine. The next morning, the sun rose over Hollow Creek, casting long shadows across the sleepy town. The streets were quiet, the townsfolk going about their day as usual, unaware of what had happened the night before. When Emily didn't show up for work, the townspeople assumed she had decided to leave. After all, Hollow Creek wasn't for everyone. They would find someone else to take her place, someone who didn't ask too many questions, someone who wouldn't wander too close to the woods. But there were a few who knew the truth. They had seen it before, people who came to the town and disappeared without a trace, their names never spoken of again. They knew that the Watcher had claimed another victim, that it would continue to watch and wait, lurking in the shadows, until the next unsuspecting soul wandered into its grasp. And so, life in Hollow Creek continued as it always had, the town's dark secret hidden away in the depths of the forest. The library remained as it was, the old book tucked away on its shelf, waiting for the next curious mind to open its pages. But if you ever find yourself in Hollow Creek, and you feel the eyes of the Watcher on you, remember this: don't look back. Don't go into the woods alone. And whatever you do, don't open the book. Because once the Watcher sees you, it never lets you go.